very much for joining us today for another exciting program for GIC. My name is George Tsakos. I'm the chair of GIC's board, and I welcome you here in Philadelphia. For those of you outside of Philadelphia, I hope you find your stay to be an exciting and engaging. As you will find engaged in our dialogue today, I cannot see more relevancy for our organization because it deals with global issues, and we know every day when we open the newspaper that interdependence is at the top of the news across the world. So we are very pleased and happy for the opportunities that we have to explore topics of interdependence, and we are very happy to host this event. I want to recognize a couple of individuals that they have made this organization a great success. First and foremost, Bill Dungelberg, who served in the previous capacity for many years as the chair of this organization.
Thank you all for coming.
And by the way, it exercises too much pressure on me because during my tenure, I'm not sure if we have been as successful as we had been under the leadership of Tang. But also I want to thank Kathleen Stephenson, a board member who has worked very hard for this program. I want to invite all of you to become members. Those of you who are not fortunate enough to be members, I will welcome your participation and hope we will see you in our event. And I would like to introduce our executive director, who will provide some greetings and some orientation for the programs. Thank you.
Thank you, George. As you said, I'm Ben Craig. I'm Executive Director of the Global Interdependence Center. Thank you for coming today. This program on Nordic economic model successes, opportunities, challenges in the future really came out of an analysis on the success of the economies of the Nordic region in the Great Recession of 2007. And it promises to be a fascinating discussion of both the region as a whole and some of the differences among the different countries in Scandinavia. A bit of background on GIC. We are a nonprofit organization headquartered here at the Philly Federal Reserve Bank. We hold programs in Philadelphia, New York, Jackson Hole, and other U.S. locales, as well as abroad, especially on issues of interdependence that touch on the economy, central banking, capital markets, and trade. In 2015, we'll be hosting programs in Philly, Jackson Hole, New York, and Chicago, as well as traveling to programs in Paris, Abu Dhabi, and Madrid. So please check out our website and come see some more programs both locally and abroad. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our partners for this program, which include our co-host, the Norwegian American Chamber of Commerce, our sponsor, Blank Rome Maritime, as well as our other partners, the Swedish American Chamber of Commerce and Global Philadelphia. We appreciate their support. Now I'd like to introduce Frode Kursum, the president of the Norwegian American Chamber of Commerce Philadelphia chapter.
Thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure for me to be here today and see all of you exploring these very interesting subjects together. I want to start out with thanking a few people, Ben particularly, and Amanda, who's been working very persistently to make sure this program became a reality. It's been quite a long journey for that. And I will also give a special thanks to Lisa, whose persistence is actually very, very instrumental in making sure we had such a great lineup today. So thank you very much, Lisa. Appreciate that very much. Also want to recognize we have a lineup of great panelists and speakers. I want to recognize also that we have the honorary consuls of Denmark and Norway of Philadelphia in the audience. Very appreciative that you guys could come. So I want to say a little bit very quickly about what we are going to talk about. I'm from a small country, Norway. In fact, all the Nordic countries combined only consist of 5 to 10% of the GNP of the US. So even combined, the Nordic countries are, economically speaking, very small. But like some other smallish countries, the Nordic countries have been known for reforms, coming up with new ideas regarding economic and social reforms. And the catchphrase is the Nordic model, which is a combination of what you can call a welfare state and a successful economic model. There is some contrasts in this model, which we look forward to hear more about in this program. There is a very high public workforce in these countries. There's a high public spending in these countries. However, on the other hand, the Nordic people are very dedicated free traders. You might be familiar with the story of the car maker Saab. Sweden did let Saab go bankrupt. And in fact, Volvo, another famous brand, is now Chinese. So there are some interesting perspectives and contrasts in that. Looking forward to exploring these topics with this afternoon and with our distinguished panels. But let me first, it's an honor for me to introduce to you Terry Miller as the keynote speaker of today. And Terry Miller is director of the Center for International Trade and Economics at the Mark Kokotronis Fellow in Economic Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. In this position, he directs the center's ongoing research into the role of free markets and international trade in fostering economic growth around the world. Prior to joining Heritage in October 2007, Miller had a distinguished career as a diplomat and public servant. In 2006, he was appointed ambassador to the United Economics and Social Council. Before that, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Global Issues. Overseas, Miller has served in Italy, France, Barbados, and New Zealand, including as head of the U.S. Observer Mission to UNESCO. He has also headed the U.S. delegation to the UN Conference on Trade Development in 2004 and was the lead negotiator for the Monterey Consensus on Financing for Development. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Mr. Terry Miller.
Good afternoon. When Lisa and Ben contacted me and asked me to speak at this conference, my first reaction was, wow, there are still people who think about the Nordic model and maybe think it's something worth talking about, and maybe even that it actually exists. I have to admit, I myself had become a bit of a skeptic about the so-called Nordic model. We've just seen too many examples of countries around the world where high taxes, high government spending have led to high debt and other consequences for the people of those countries that are not altogether positive. And yet, we know that the Nordic countries themselves don't seem, for the most part, to be afflicted by these negative consequences. So there must be something worth looking at here, and I certainly decided to take another look. I'm sitting on a 20-year database of information about economic policies and economic outcomes in countries around the world as part of my job at the Heritage Foundation, and I thought that within that material there might be something worth looking at. Well, what I discovered was very positive indeed. We're here today to discuss a region of the world where, if I can borrow the words of Garrison Keillor, all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. Well, in fact, we're talking about a region of the world in which 25 million of the most successful people on the planet Earth live. So they must be doing something right in these countries. It's an idyllic picture, but one the Nordic countries clearly live up to. Think about lifespan. It's over 81 years on average in these countries, and that's compared to 71 in the rest of the world. How about incomes? $36,000 per capita or better in all of the Nordic countries, compared to a worldwide average of about $10,000 per capita. How about education? Over 82% of people in the Nordic countries have a high school education or better. Well, that compares to just 75% in the other developed countries around the world. And one last thing, how about happiness? It's not just about economic outcomes. Happiness. 82% of the population in the Nordic countries say they have a positive experience on an average day. That is, they're more likely to think about feelings of pride or enjoyment than they are to have feelings of worry or sadness. That's a pretty important thing. Well, something good is going on in these countries. And you're going to hear from a lot of very bright people today who have a lot of good information and ideas about what might be causing that. I want to start with a little bit of a more basic question, really, and that is, are the Nordic countries above average because of something we call a Nordic model? And if so, what are the characteristics of that model? Is it nothing more than a large welfare state? Is it just some form of socialism? Is it just high spending, high taxes? How do those policies contribute to successful outcomes? Or is there something else driving Nordic success? Are there individual or cultural characteristics that might be really what we should be talking about in these countries? Are there cultural characteristics that the government itself can play a role in promoting? What's the interplay between culture and government? Well, that's the area I would really like to explore in my remarks today. The data on which I'm going to base my conclusions are drawn from the Index of Economic Freedom. This is a volume that we produce at the Heritage Foundation with the Wall Street Journal. Every year we look at 10 categories of economic freedom in 186 countries around the world. They cover things like regulatory efficiency, the size of government, the rule of law. We look at openness and competition in societies. I've given you each a highlights booklet that summarizes the main results of this. I brought one copy of the full volume with me, and one of you is welcome to it if you just come grab it at the end of the presentation, and it's yours. The complete text of this book and all our databases is online at heritage.org. So we try to be as transparent as we possibly can about both what our data is and how we draw our conclusions from that data. The Nordic countries do quite well overall on this index. In the global rankings for 2015, you've got the 2014 book there. The 2015 is coming out next month. But I've got the rankings here. Denmark ranks 11th. Finland is 19th. Sweden 23rd. Norway is 27th in our new rankings. So think about that for a minute. You have a conservative think tank, and the leading business and financial newspaper in the United States who are ranking these so-called socialist or welfare-oriented countries in the top 15% of countries in the world on economic freedom, which, when you get right down to it, is just another form of free market capitalism. So something's wrong with either our language or perhaps with our view of these countries. Words like socialism or capitalism can as easily obscure what's going on as illuminate, and it could be that that's part of the problem. So I want to go just a little bit deeper into the data and see if we can figure out what's going on in these countries. When you look at the individual categories of economic freedom, several results for the Nordic countries stand out very sharply. All of the countries score very highly on rule of law. We measure that by looking at property rights, intellectual property. We look at it through data on judicial fairness. We look particularly at corruption. The corruption scores for the Nordic countries are absolutely amazing. Denmark, Denmark is tied for first place in freedom from corruption. Finland ranks second, Sweden is third, Norway is fifth. New Zealand slipped in there somewhere. Norway, I think, deserves special commendation, though. No other country that depends so heavily on oil or mining has corruption scores anywhere near as good as those achieved by Norway. So given the structure and nature of its economy and some of the particular challenges it faces, I think it deserves special commendation even at fifth place in those rankings. So what's the societal characteristic that's apparent from the rule of law rankings that we have? Well, I think it's honesty. And I'd like, if you will, for you to just sort of write it, I don't have a pencil here, but let's write it on our mental whiteboard, honesty, because I'm going to have a few more of these characteristics I want you to think about as we go along. We measure openness to competition with data on trade, trade restrictions, investment laws, banking regulations, all kinds of government policies like that, trade, investment, banking. The Nordic scores in these areas are, again, among the best in the world. Average tariffs on imported goods are under 1%. Think of that, tariffs under 1%. Special tax breaks for politically favored industries are kept to a minimum. There are few restrictions on investment. Foreign and domestic investors are treated the same. Banking systems are modern and efficient. There's plenty of capital available and it's easily accessible by entrepreneurs. So what's the societal characteristic when you think about the openness, the trade, the fairness? I think fairness perhaps is the right word, and I'd like to add that to the list. So we had honesty, and now let's put fairness up here as the second characteristic of these societies. How about regulatory efficiency? That's one of the categories we focus on. The Nordic countries have a commercial regulatory system that is among the most business-friendly in the world. Denmark is, in our freedom rankings, Denmark is in second place. It's second only to Hong Kong, which happens to rank #1 overall in our Index of Economic Freedom. All of the Nordic countries place among the top 20 in ease of doing business. Let's call that societal characteristic efficiency. Put it on our list. We had honesty, fairness, and now efficiency. So I've got 3 up there. Now, labor freedom is another category we look at, and that's something that's a very different animal. Here there's a sharp split among the Nordic countries. There's a split both in policies and in outcomes. Denmark has the 3rd most liberal labor regulations in the world. And that's liberal in the classic sense, or the European sense of the word, promoting liberty. We have a little bit of a different definition in the United States these days for that word. But in terms of being liberal and promoting liberty, Denmark ranks 3rd in the world. By contrast, the other Nordic countries range between 117th and 141st in the rankings on labor freedom. So there's this huge split in terms of freedom of the labor market within the Nordic countries themselves. Denmark 3rd, Norway, it's Norway down in 141st place. So that's quite a difference. And the labor market outcomes are quite different too. Unemployment in Norway is under 4%. In the other countries, it's closer to 8%. So here's a pretty big difference, and it starts to make me uncomfortable when I think that it's Norway down here at 141st that has the best outcome in this regard. So that's really going against the trend in our rankings. In our overall rankings of labor freedom, there's a pretty strong relationship between low levels of labor regulation or high levels of labor freedom and low levels of unemployment. Well, Norway's clearly an outlier here, and I'm hoping perhaps that some of you can help explain that in the discussion as we go forward today. But there's another thing too. A higher percentage of people work in Norway than in other countries, on average. So you have a higher percentage of the population in Norway working than in the other countries. But the flip side of that is that they tend to work fewer hours. So there really are some unusual things going on in terms of the labor market, and even between Norway and the other countries in the region. More consistent with what we expect worldwide, Denmark with the really high score, you remember it was up here in third place on the rankings, it's really doing the best job in the region in terms of bringing down its unemployment rate. We're seeing a declining trend in unemployment in Denmark. It's relatively flat in the other countries, so we're not seeing the kinds of improvements there that we would hope to see as recovery from this recession that we've been through continues to take place. But we're here to talk about the Nordic model, and I would have to say that because of the mixed results we see in the labor rankings, I don't think labor freedom has much to do with it. So I'm going to put that aside. But there is one labor market characteristic that does seem reflective of a Nordic difference. And that is that more people work in the Nordic countries overall than in other countries. It's not just Norway, it's all of the countries are on the very high end of the scale. 73% of Nordics are working compared to 65% of people in most developed countries. So that's a pretty significant difference. And I think that rates a societal characteristic, since I'm making this list here. Let's call it industriousness. So let's add that out here, industriousness. We have honesty, fairness, efficiency, and now industriousness. I need a pencil, but anyway, there you have it. Now we get to the part that I, as a small government conservative, I'm going to be a little uncomfortable with, and that's the taxes and government spending part. An obvious characteristic of anything we call a Nordic model, I think, would have to be large government. I see a lot of smiles around the room at that, so probably no disagreement. On measures of both taxes and government spending, the Nordic countries rank among the worst in the world. That's my value judgment, the worst in the world. Denmark actually has the highest overall tax burden of any country we measure. The other Nordics are not far behind. The same is true of government spending. All the Nordic countries rank in the bottom 20% of our rankings in terms of government spending and taxes. That means they have higher levels of government spending per capita compared to their overall size of the economies than other countries. In fact, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden rank in the bottom 5% on this indicator worldwide. Still, these countries are achieving good economic results for the most part. Some of you may argue that given the current situation, but I think if you put it in context of what's happening in the rest of the world and what's happening historically, we really do see very positive outcomes in the Nordic countries. So one strong relationship in our index is a very positive correlation between high incomes and high levels of economic freedom. So the Nordic countries certainly qualify as high income, though not, with the exception of Norway, among the very highest in the world. Per capita incomes in Sweden, Finland, and Denmark are $10,000 to $15,000 below per capita incomes here in the United States, for example. Another strong correlation in our data is between changes in economic freedom and economic growth rates. Economic growth rates are just the change in growth or change in the size of the economy. So we have this relationship between the change in freedom and the change in economic size or what we call the economic growth rate. Countries with high levels of economic freedom tend to have higher growth rates than other countries. Well, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark jumped up in our rankings in the early 2000s. And just as you would expect, their economic growth rates peaked in about 2006 at something over 4% in most of those countries. Their economic freedom stagnated after that, and their economic growth rates have declined. And now they're below 2% or around 2% or less in all the countries. They're negative in some of the latest data in a couple of the countries. So we see that relationship holding very strongly within the data, even for the Nordic countries. So measured by income, though, I talked about it earlier, they're all $36,000 per capita or higher. These are good results, but not the best. So what accounts then for the decisions by these governments in these countries? And these are democratic decisions. The population supports this, to have these big governments, to have these high taxes. How does that work, that you have these, the people in these countries willingly supporting such high levels of taxes and government spending? There must be something going on there that we could look at. One answer seems to me to be the high levels of trust in government that are exhibited in these countries. I know in Norway and Sweden, for example, they're among the highest in the world in terms of trust in government. 66% in Norway and 58% of the people in Sweden claim to have a very high degree of trust in government. Is that a characteristic of all the Nordic countries? Well, interestingly, no. On the same survey, Denmark came in only at 39%. Only 39% of Danes have a high level of trust in their government. That's just about the average level for Europe as a whole. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there, but clearly for at least some of the Nordic countries, we have this very high level of trust in government. So I would like to add that, I think, to the list of societal characteristics. So we'll put trust in government out here along with the others. Honesty, fairness, efficiency. Industriousness, thank you, and trust in government. I've got 5 up there so far. So let's recap where we've gotten so far. In terms of economic policies, the Nordic countries have very high levels of business freedom. They have great openness and respect for the idea of competition. They have great openness in areas of trade freedom and investment freedom. They have very high levels of government and taxation. That's starting to paint a picture. In terms of societal characteristics, maybe it's more interesting. We have a very low tolerance for corruption, high degrees of honesty, efficiency, fairness, industriousness, trust in government. We're building a pretty good picture of what a Nordic model might look like. And it looks very positive. Now, I'm still troubled by the high levels of government and taxation. Particularly if we're looking at this as a model that might be exported to other countries. And I think when you talk about a Nordic model, implicit in that is the idea that there might be something here that other countries ought to look at. There's something there worth looking at. So I'm a little troubled by taxes and government spending because, in fact, we have seen that in most countries around the world that have high levels of government spending, you also have very high levels of government debt. And in those countries, those high levels of government debt have led to, in some cases, the collapse of social services, a failure of sustainability, and even societal unrest. You just think of a place like Greece, for example, and you can imagine some of the negative impacts of high levels of public debt. Interestingly, the Nordic countries don't have high levels of debt. And that's really a very striking characteristic of countries with such high levels of government spending. I wrote down the numbers here. Public debt levels range from 34% to 53% in the Nordic countries. That's well within ranges that are considered safe for developed countries. I just can't imagine a problem by debt, public debt at those levels in a developed country. So if we take debt off the table as a concern, are there other aspects of the tax code or government spending patterns that are producing better results in Scandinavia than in other countries? And I think maybe there are. Let's look at taxes. Personal income tax rates are extremely high in these countries. Well, at least in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, less so in Finland. On the other hand, corporate tax rates are much more modest. So you have high personal rates and more modest corporate rates. The corporate income tax rates are less than the OECD average in all of these countries, and they're coming down in these countries too. In most of them, there are moves to further lower corporate income tax rates. All the countries have a value-added tax. The standard rates are about 25% in all of the countries. That's pretty high, higher than averages in European countries. Certainly higher than Germany, France, or the UK. Other countries like that have lower VAT rates than the rates in the Nordic countries. So what we have as part of the Nordic model, I think you would have to say, you have high rates of taxes on personal income. You have high rates of taxes on consumption, but you have modest taxation of businesses. So, in other words, you have a Nordic model that is pro-government, but it's not anti-business. I think that's a very important characteristic of the model. How about spending? Well, the data here are harder to analyze. There clearly is a strong commitment in the Nordic countries to spending that I would characterize not as consumption, but rather as investment. And this includes not just normal things like infrastructure, but also investment in people. Things like education, things like childcare, things that actually make it easier for people to work. Remember, we talked about how more people in these countries work than people in other countries. Well, maybe there's a link to these government policies that actually make it easier for people to work, or ways in which the government might invest in the people to make them more productive when they do work. Is that part of the Nordic model? I think it probably is, but it's also important to know that that type of spending is not unique to the Nordic countries. It's pretty characteristic throughout Europe as well, although to varying degrees. And even here in the United States, we have some spending of that type, though most often funded at the state level rather than the federal level. There's one characteristic of the labor force, though, in the Nordic countries that really stands out. Any ideas what that is? There's one area where it's quite different. Anybody guess? Yes?
Unions.
No?
Less lawyers?
Yes, ma'am?
More vacation or flex time?
It's not what I was thinking of. Yes, sir?
Hours worked,
What's that?
hours worked,
Hours worked. We talked about that. That's one.
women.
Women.
Yeah.
Gender equality. All the countries in the Nordic region are in the top 5 in the OECD in terms of gender equality. There's an interesting question then, I think, to be asked is, are there government policies that contribute to that trend? And I think the answer almost certainly is yes. And so that's an area where I think you might want to undertake some further exploration. But let's add that to the list. I haven't forgotten my list here. So gender equality, I want to put on the list up here. And there's one other societal characteristic. I've only got one more that I want to add to the list, and it's in some ways a little bit more sensitive, especially for an American audience. But I think it's becoming sensitive in the Nordic countries as well. Given the immigration debates we're having in this country and also in the Nordic countries. And the characteristic, I'm going to call it societal homogeneity, if you will. Remember how we started. All the people are strong, all the people are good looking, all the people are above average. I think there's some truth to that in the Nordic countries, actually. I would hypothesize, though I can't prove, that greater societal homogeneity creates a much higher tolerance for high government expenditures. In many cases, the recipients of government largesse and the taxpayers who fund that largesse are actually the same people. They're just passing money through government, and there's a lot of money going through government in these countries, but the recipients and the payers tend to be the same people, or at least from the same groups of people. So there's an identification there, and nobody feels like we're creating winners or losers through this government action of passing all this money through government. We know that the Nordic countries have relatively high levels of homogeneity in the population. It's not all that different from other European countries. It's just on the high end, if you will, of homogeneity. But there's one way in which they stand apart, and that is the pace of change. Actually, over the last 5 years for which I could find data, and I think that was 2007 through 2011, the percentage of foreign-born people in the Nordic countries, the percentage of people foreign-born in the Nordic countries has increased by at least 1 percentage point. Now, we're talking about levels of the population that range from maybe 5% of the population to 10 or 12% of the population. So a 1% increase in that is pretty significant. It can mean, you know, if you put it in percentage change terms, it would be like a 20% increase in the foreign-born population in the country. So the pace of change here is pretty high compared to other countries in the European region. Now, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that over time this could have the effect of undermining this great support for all these intra-governmental, intra-country transfers of wealth that are going on. And you might actually undermine, at some point, some of the public support. Remember, we talked about the democratic decisions to support these high levels of government spending and taxes among the population. Well, as your population tends to lose some of its homogeneity, it is perhaps the case that some of that support that exists now could begin to erode. I don't think that's happened yet. I don't think it's on the immediate horizon, but I think at some point this could be a threat to to what we call the Nordic model. So anyway, that was my last one, cultural homogeneity. I've got the list up here now. I've tried to build a portrait of the Nordic countries based on the data that is available. And really, I've tried to look at national income, I've tried to look at demographics, and I've tried to look at government policies. So I think all those areas have a part to play. In terms of income, we have moderately high income countries. They have low growth rates, economic growth rates. I think we have to take that really as an outcome in the model. I don't think that's a driving characteristic. That's the result of what else is going on. We have a homogeneous population with high levels of education, honesty, fairness. Those were on the list, you remember? A low tolerance for corruption, a very high proclivity to work, extraordinary gender equality, an unusually high degree of trust in government. Well, let's take all that as a given, if you will. That's the Nordic context. That's the characteristics of this society we're dealing with. So we've got these income outcomes, we've got this context of characteristics. So what about the government policies? We've got efficient and business-friendly regulation. We've got minimal regulation of trade and investment, very high levels of taxes and government, and a significant investment focus, particularly investment in human capital in terms of government spending. So that really is your Nordic model, right there. That's the model. And it obviously works very well in the Nordic context. Outside that context, I'm not so sure, really. I'm not. Business-friendly regulation is great when you have honest businessmen, when you have hard workers. If you don't have a high proclivity to work like you have in the Nordic countries, then maybe trade and investment freedom are going to cause some problems for you. Maybe you're going to start to lose your jobs and your entrepreneurs overseas. Maybe you have more deficits, dependency, because of the structure then. And without a high degree of trust in government, well, I think the high levels of taxes and government spending are just not going to be possible. The controversy is just going to become extreme, not unlike what we see in Washington. Governments looking to emulate the success of the Nordic countries might want to look first at those areas I've dubbed the Nordic context. That was our list up here. All those wonderful things. I think if leaders would look to promote honesty, trust, integrity in government, gender equality, really fairness throughout society as a whole. I think if you invest in people, both their capabilities and their character, you'll go a long way towards creating a context that will build for success. I think only then, only when you've addressed all those characteristics, should you worry about, really about what the government should or should not do in terms of economic policy. Economic success follows from good character and from hard work. And we've seen the Nordic countries have all of that in high measure. That, not some magic formula for government spending or taxation, is really what we're talking about when we talk about the Nordic model. Thank you very much.
Any questions? questions for Esmeralda? He's happy to take them.
Happy to answer questions or hear comments. Yes, sir.
How much does the North Sea oil contribute to the economic success of the Nordic model?
Well, I don't actually think, in my opinion, I'm happy to hear from others, but I don't think it contributes very much at all to the model. I think that's a sort of fluke, if you will, and a very positive one. I mean, they did have to go explore for it and develop it, and it's not a big job creator at this point in the Nordic economy. It's certainly providing a resource stream for Norway, and I think there's really an example in the way they managed it with the fund. I can't remember the name of the fund.
Sovereign Wealth Fund.
So the Sovereign Wealth Fund that they have put in place to manage that stream of income and extend it over time. I think that's a model that other countries could well emulate. So I think that's there, but in terms of the Nordic model itself, in anything that might be exportable to other countries, you know, as I'm saying this, I'm changing my mind. Because I'm thinking about all those characteristics I talked about earlier, honesty, integrity, things like that, the very low corruption scores. I mean, that has made it possible for Norway to exploit that North Sea resource in a way that's positive for society as a whole, where when we go to other countries around the world, particularly in the developing world, oil really has turned out to be a curse in many of those countries rather than a blessing. And it's because the profits are siphoned off. It turns out to be something that increases the disparities in income within society, has all kinds of negative repercussions in terms of just the honesty, respect for human rights, all kinds of problems that are created in countries by these resource endowments. And so we really do have, in the Norwegian case, a marvelous example of how to do it right.
Does your report indicate what percentage the economies depend on fossil fuels from the North Sea?
No.
But just to
somebody
be
may
clear, I'm Swedish. These Norwegians don't share this.
No.
Just to be clear, okay? It's one of the, they don't share this wealth from one with a neighbor country. It's one country of the four. So the other three don't benefit from this. It's one, it's Norway. The fact that Sweden owned Norway a few hundred years ago, that's a difference.
That was the Volvo agreement.
Yeah, it was.
Which actually raises a good point. The Nordic countries are not necessarily so collaborating all that much industrial-wise. We talked about actually there was called the Volvo agreement, which was actually Volvo and Statoil were going to form some kind of a merger where actually the Norwegian oil wealth was going to be complementary to supplying Sweden with wealth, plus Norway was going to get industries from manufacturing. It's really dead on the right.
It was. But it was a smart deal by Mr. Gyllenhammar.
So are you telling me we have to not talk about a Nordic model, but talk about a Swedish model, a Norwegian model, a Danish model?
I think there's healthy rivalry on a friendly level between these countries.
Oh, well, I talked about competition, so
Yes.
I like that. Yes, ma'am.
Does the gender equality also translate into government at all levels in the Nordic model?
They do have high levels of participation by women in government.
At all levels?
At all levels. There's a glass ceiling. I don't know if it's a ceiling, but women are struggling in all countries to achieve full equality throughout the range of jobs. But we do have people that have reached the highest levels in these countries. Is it fully equal in every respect? You know, you need a sociologist or somebody up here to talk about that. Really, women have, let me say this right and not get into trouble. Women have characteristics or things that they do, choose to do and have to do with their lives that are different in some respects from men. And just think about child rearing as the easiest one, or just the birthing process, the motherhood process. I'm not sure we're ever going to get to 100% equality because of I mean, I'm all about freedom. I talk about economic freedom all the time, but I'm also all about personal freedom. And personal freedom also is freedom. It's not just freedom to do anything you want to do, but it's also freedom to not do things that perhaps other people choose to do. And I think that's a freedom, especially that women think about sometimes in connection with business. But I am certainly not the right person qualified to talk about that. Yes, sir.
Professor, you evoked rather fascinatingly a picture of a changing governmental perception, or changing perception of the usefulness of a large government in terms of extending services to a more heterogeneous community. This in turn kind of reminds one of the very singular place that a Nordic model has represented in our culture in the U.S. For example, in The Great Gatsby of S. Scott Fitzgerald, you have Tom Buchanan, I think somewhat satirically on the part of Fitzgerald, representing or at least trying to claim ownership of a Nordic set of values. All of this to say, what do you see in terms of openness to a more pluralistic society? What kinds of trends within the Nordic model, what kinds of dissident voices do you perceive that could also be exportable as we evolve to a kind of post-colonial world?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that the Nordic, one of the things that they have created for us as an example is this idea of cultural and of equal treatment, if you will. I listed fairness on my list of characteristics. I think the Nordic countries, more than any other probably countries in the world, have this sort of fundamental ingrained idea of fairness that they try to implement not only in their everyday interactions, but through the government. And this question of government size is one of the most difficult we deal with in our rankings of economic freedom, actually, because there's no one right size of government that we've been able to determine for countries around the world. It's probable that there's a different level, a different right size of government for every country in the world. And it may also be that it changes over time, which is another important characteristic. It may be particularly important in the case of the Nordic countries, where we've seen in recent years now a little bit of a tendency to pull back on the size of government in these countries. I don't know whether that's driven, I talked about it in terms of the homogeneity of the population, but that trend is very, very small so far, and it may be that there are other things driving. There's a kind of practicality and pragmatism. I started to put pragmatism on my list, but I couldn't come up with a good example in the data for that. But I think that's also a characteristic that the Nordic personality, if you will, brings to the table, a willingness to experiment. So I think what we will see over time, one of the characteristics of the Nordic model is that it seems to be a model that is conducive to evolution or change. There seems to be a willingness in these countries to experiment with different policies, and they really went down the road of government spending and high taxes in a quite extreme way compared to the rest of the world. Now we're seeing a little bit of backing away from that and trying something else. So I think in that way, we have also a very positive example of the learning process within a government, how you can learn to evolve and to stay current and credible. More? Yes, sir.
Representing one of the Nordic countries. So I would like to come back to the question that you raised very often, which is the question of taxation, which seems to be like an obsession for every American.
Absolutely. I plead guilty.
And my comment is, it goes as follows, that as you pointed out, maybe the most distinguished characteristics of any Nordic country is the egalitarian character of the society. It's the most important thing. It's the society that permits social mobility, upwards mobility for all the members. Every person has equal chances to get upwards in the ladder of the society. That was also called the American dream at some point.
Yes.
So the taxes, for example, a middle class civil servant, I pay 32% of taxes, personal income taxes. I get education from the cradle to doctorate to my sons and daughters. I get public health to all my family. And I don't find really anybody around me that would complain about taxes. And I'm very being honest with this. And if there's discontent, it is because state cannot deliver anymore. So with the promise that you pay taxes and you get these services, health and education. And it's the case of health in Finland, for example. The money isn't enough for the need of the aging people. So we have to see other innovative measures that would take also the private providers to the game. But in all, the tax issue is not the same kind of issue as it is here, that less taxes is better. It's that we pay taxes gladly as long as we get delivered.
Well, I actually don't disagree with anything you said. I mean, you said you pay taxes gladly because you can see the benefits you're receiving for that. And I guess my question is, what happens when you stop seeing that connection between the two? Then do you no longer pay taxes so willingly or gladly? There's an unusually high degree of efficiency. I put that on my list. I had efficiency up there on my mental checklist. And I think that's one of the things that enables this to work in the Nordic society. If you have a society that's somewhat less efficient and somewhat less honest, then I think that connection between the taxes you pay on the one hand and the services you're receiving on the other, it's going to start to get pretty wide apart at some point. And then the consensus behind that whole model collapses at that point. I don't know whether we're there in the U.S. That's certainly part of the debate in the U.S. It's not just about the size of the tax burden. It's whether we're receiving value for the money that we pay in taxes in the U.S. That's really the question. Yes, sir.
If I tagged onto this gentleman's question there and turn it around, which would be the least efficient tax system? I love this country, by the way. I'm Swedish. But for the money you pay in this country or what you receive, there is a disconnect versus your story. So who would be where you pay the most and get the least in the world?
Where you pay the most?
On a relative basis.
I'm thinking Latin America someplace, but
high degree of corruption, no trust, no efficiency.
No efficiency. Yeah, I mean, this is the fundamental question when you're talking about this whole Nordic model, I think, because the image of it we have in our mind, and it's a pretty simplistic image, is high government, high spending, lots of government services, high taxes, and somehow it works. But really, can you translate that to any other social setting? Well, maybe. I mean, it could even be that you can translate that to a place like China at the end of the day. I don't know. That's an intriguing possibility when you think about it. Although there at the moment are high levels of corruption in China, but maybe that's the kind of an Asian society of some sort where you could. I should have been a sociologist because all these economic questions of policy ultimately come down to psychology and sociology. So I don't know the answer there, but I do have some concern that this model, which works so well in the Nordic countries may not actually be a thing that at least the high taxes and spending part we should think about exporting to other countries.
Do you know what was the model country for Swedish Social Democrats when they started to figure out how would be the welfare state?
Yeah.
It was Uruguay.
Uruguay.
Yes.
But just the fact that Uruguay screwed it up. But they did. This was in the 50s.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your remarks, because it's really very thought-provoking. And just to follow up on all these observations, one thing that strikes me here in the U.S. when we talk about the fact that, yes, at the end of the day, being taxed in Scandinavia and you get all these services, the counter-argument in the U.S. is, well, but you don't have the choice. Here we have choices. And it's very interesting to put always that in the context of choices, when in fact, as a sociologist, you probably would say, well, maybe not. Maybe not. You might have a certain level of income choices that, many people would probably not have, generally speaking. So it's an interesting dynamic, and I would say almost like the counter argument of well, high taxes or many choices that you can have, either or, but you can't have both.
Yeah, the thing that's most interesting about this debate, that the issues that are raised with me when I'm talking about this kind of high government model versus a low government model, particularly with the European audience, the two areas that I hear about all the time are education, where education is mostly government provided and funded in Europe, and healthcare. And these are, of course, the two areas where in the United States we are suffering horribly from very, very high levels of inflation in terms of the costs that we have to pay for these, and very great struggles for people at all levels, but certainly for the middle class in the United States to find a way to pay for these things that are provided for free, not only in the Nordic countries, but in many other European countries as well. So it is very interesting to me that it comes down to not to choices really, but to whether you can actually access these things that are so important to our well-being as humans. Yes, sir. And then we'll go back there.
I suspect I know the answer to this, but I will ask you anyway. If the Nordic countries tomorrow decided they will hire you as a consultant, and they asked you what will be the most significant change that you will bring about to their economies, what would you say, and why would you say it?
Speak up.
I have to say nothing leaps to mind right now, because I hope I conveyed adequately that I think these are very successful economies right now. I think I would pay extraordinary attention to government debt levels and the deficits, and I think that the countries are actually doing that right now. So I think that for the most part getting it right. I don't know that I would have a sort of radical suggestion for change or a suggestion for radical change, if you will. I think that just to be safe, some shrinkage or some just a sense of modesty towards expectations for what government can do and can do effectively would be important. There is the problem of low growth right now, and that can spread into all kinds of other problems if that persists for a long time. So something needs to be done. I don't think there's pump priming or government spending that can do much there. So maybe on the tax side, there might be some policies that could stimulate growth little bit more than the policies right now, I think that's the area I'd look at, but I don't have a lot. Back in the back, yes ma'am.
There's something I wanted to point out. One of the things that I value much about the Nordic economic model and the job market there is the availability of jobs in philosophy and in the humanities and in progressive pedagogy. I lived in Oslo in 2008, first to study philosophy with children and then to teach it. And I also taught in Iceland. And many of my colleagues, and I'm also a trained philosophical counselor, and that is a career in Norway and in Sweden and in Denmark. And people are employed in hospitals and in prisons and throughout society. Also, the humanist society in Oslo is very significant, at least I know it most in Oslo, of children of parents who are atheists or agnostics and still want their children to experience the confirmation, and that transitional role in a child's life and doing it through philosophical engagement. So when you mentioned pragmatism, and Dewey is taught a lot in Oslo to young persons, I think this is really significant, and it speaks to the higher quality of life that I experienced when living in Scandinavia, and that I think is a shame that it doesn't take place here. So all my training is in philosophy, and I had to leave the country to really find work in my early and mid-20s to do it, and I had to leave that career back in America because there's not the support system or the economic capacity for someone to employ me to do what I'm best trained to do. So I find that fascinating and is really one of, to me, the most valuable things that Scandinavia has to offer. And the training that young people get in philosophy throughout their educational system, I think, better prepares them to be actively engaged in society and active citizens and more tolerant in their engagement with the changing face of Scandinavian countries.
Well, I appreciate that comment, and I did say at the beginning that we were talking about societies where 25 million of in effect the happiest people in the world live in these societies because of the way they have structured them and the way they work and the way they organize themselves. I do think it's important, if I can just defend our country a little bit, it's important not to fall into the trap of comparing a country with 5 million people with a country with 325 million people. The United States is an extraordinarily diverse place, and while the kinds of things you talked about may not exist universally or in every corner of the United States, there are certainly corners of the United States in which those things do, in fact, exist in the same measure that you would find them in any Scandinavian country. It's not by accident that I borrowed from Garrison Keillor, thinking about Minnesota, for example, where you would find some of the characteristics that you talked about in society. But we're a very big, diverse country, and we have a lot of different strengths, and we have some weaknesses, and it's just very difficult to compare what goes on in a smaller, more homogeneous place with a place like the United States. You almost have to look at all of Europe and compare that to the United States. It might be a more fair comparison.
I hate to break off questions, but why don't we take a coffee break and you're around for a little bit to answer questions, and we'll be back for the close.
If this was a maritime conference, you'd ignore me and keep going for at least 10 minutes. This is quite refreshing. I'm Tony Salgado. I'm a partner with the law firm of Blank Rome. We have offices in, of course, Philadelphia, New York, D.C., where I'm from, Houston, L.A., Shanghai, and some other places. Blank Rome Maritime is a logo we use for our maritime practice. We are the largest maritime practice in the United States, and as many of you might know, maritime law is one of those practices that frequently has an international component to it. And in that regard, one of the reasons I was asked to moderate this panel is that we represent Aker Philadelphia Shipyard ASA, which is the Norwegian publicly traded company that owns the shipyard here in Philadelphia. We also represent American Shipping Company ASA, which is another Norwegian listed company that bought 10 of those tankers. tankers, as you may know, are quite expensive, and so it's a very capital-intensive industry. And we work frequently with Scandinavian banks and businessmen. And one of the things I wanted to just comment on, following up on Ambassador Miller's comments, is I was the one who said fewer lawyers. When we deal with with the Norwegian lawyers, they're always taken aback by how long it takes us to draft agreements. They cannot understand it. They are beside themselves when they deal with us. And I think it goes to the honesty, the trust, a much more of a partnership approach to business. In the U.S., people don't trust each other. You want to write a loan contract to cover everything under the sun, and we have to persuade them that if there's a loss in the United States, you're going to want this. Well, you never do this in Norway. I understand. Just as an example, we listed a few companies this year on the Oslo over-the-counter market, and the procedures that you use to list a company in this market the paperwork is unbelievably thin compared to a securities law practice. It's amazing, We took them and promptly, because they were being offered to buyers in the United States, promptly marked them up and made them much thicker by putting in lots of risk factors and things. Well, without further ado, we're going to have a slight change in the panel as advertised, and it's another example of Norwegian efficiency. We've reduced the panel from 2 to 2. Jarl Friis Madsen from Denmark is unfortunately ill today and passes his regrets and will not be able to attend. But we have Leif Trana from the Embassy of Norway in Washington, where he is with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm sorry, he was with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Oslo before he joined the embassy in D.C. Just earlier this year. And we also have Jukka Pietikäinen, who's the ambassador to the permanent mission of Finland to the United States. Sorry, not now?
Consul General.
You're the Consul General, okay. Yes, sorry. He's currently the Consul General of Finland in New York since September 2012. And so we'll let Leif start us off.
You told me to short, so that's why. That's me.
Thank you. As any good Nordic, I was given a task, and I will then see to have my presentation structured accordingly. I'm going to start saying a few words on the structure of the Norwegian economy, and I'll try to sort of be precisioned on what factors would be true for most of the Nordic countries, if not all, and what would be particular for Norway. First, on the structure of the economy, and Ambassador Miller has already been touching on a lot of these points. A major part of the structure of the Norwegian, as in all of the Nordic economies, as Ambassador Miller said, is the high workforce participation and a very highly skilled workforce. That's one of the strengths. In Norway, 74% of the people between 15 and 74 work. Similarly, the similar number in the U.S. is actually 62.7%. So that consists of the two ladies with the computer in the upper left-hand corner. The next is, and I think this is true for all the Nordic countries as well, most people work in the service industry. The traditional sort of industrial base, there is one, but it's much, much smaller than it is in many other developed countries. In Norway, 77% of the people work in the service industry. Only 20% work in regular industry, and 2% in ag and fisheries. So we're very sort of service-minded industry. The third one, this plan of containers, is meant to illustrate the fact that, and I will disagree with my esteemed colleague here from the Chamber of Commerce, we are not a small economy. We are a medium-sized economy. Actually, I think the Nordics combined Norway alone is in the 24th something biggest economy in the world, and combined the Nordics would be in the G20, so we're not that small. The one thing though, and Ambassador Miller touched on this, we do not produce everything. And this is, I think, has been a very, both a political decision and also a decision from industry. Instead of trying to compete with a lot of the goods made in other places in the world, United States, China, and I'll get to that, we produce fewer things, and we import the rest of them. The fourth one is an oil rig. And here is, as my Swedish colleague said, here's the difference between Norway and the other 4 Nordic countries. We were fortunate enough to find oil in the mid-60s. That oil has served us very well. We currently have, although Ambassador Miller said that we have a public debt of 34% of GDP, that is true, yes, but we also have a sovereign wealth fund of $850 billion. So the size of the public debt really isn't that much relevant. But that industry has, so it's a driver in the economy. I think one person asked of how big it is. It's petroleum consists, I think, of, I had written that down somewhere, around 50% of our exports. But not only have we been able to benefit from this sort of, from the revenue from the oil and gas, but it is not easy extracting oil from the North Sea. It is cold, dark, deep water. So the technology that we, along with many other the companies that started our sort of oil adventure, were Americans. Now we're exporting back a lot of technology to U.S. companies in Alaska, in places like Brazil, and also in the Gulf of Mexico. So our technology, we managed to sort of not only extract the rents from it, but also getting quite a bit of the technology and innovative service. Then on to our successes. You will notice that on all the pictures where I have pictures of people, there are mainly women. Which, when I looked over the program, one thing that struck me was, there are no women here. Which, thinking of sort of what would be the key to success, it was somewhat disappointing. I obviously can't do anything about not being a woman, but but there should be more women here. So, but some of the keys to the successes, and here I'll go a bit back and forth. Ambassador Miller mentioned trust, and he mentioned trust in government. And yes, trust in government is important, but it's not only trust in government, it is a general trust within the population. Here it is, I've used, this is a picture taken from the central wage bargaining that takes place every year. In Norway, we have a system, I don't know if this is true for Finland and Sweden as well, but I think it's 2 points, where the wage bargaining starts with the competitive industries, the industries that compete with the rest of the world, they bargain first. And whichever wage increase they agree to, that is generally set as the example for the rest of the economy. There can be small variations, but that sort of sets the limit on the wage growth, which allows even protected areas of the economy, like myself, I'm in government. And I mean, with very low unemployment, you would think, we'd have a field day in our wage negotiations. But we're not, because that is generally set by the companies that compete with the rest of the world. As Ambassador Miller said, there's low corruption. There's a general sense, I think, in all the Nordic countries that the government is sort of, it's there, it's a decent tool to make our lives better. We get, well-run education, pretty decently organized childcare and healthcare. There's big arguments of just how to organize it, and a lot of us are pragmatic, whether then the government pays for a private company to do it, or the government does it itself. It doesn't really matter. Sort of, the government takes care of it and generally does a decent job, so we basically leave it alone. The fact this trust has also allowed the Nordic countries to do stuff that the rest of Europe has not. And that is deal with difficult issues within a country without great social unrest. And one of the examples is we have raised the age of retirement, the effective age of retirement by a couple of years. And basically, that was a deal between the unions, between the employers and the government, all three parties, and this three-party configuration is something not found many other places. That is pretty unique to the Nordic countries, but that has allowed sort of this big change to have taken place without massive strikes you've seen in France and Italy and many other places. People sort of, okay, we probably don't like that we have to work longer, but we understand the rationale, and, these are generally good people, and they generally take good care of us, so, okay, we keep working. The other thing we've been able to do is to focus on retraining. I mean, it's hard to, Ambassador Miller mentioned it, it's hard in some Nordic countries to get rid of workers in industries, and Norway is one of them. There is an exception though, is if an industry goes under, yes, they can lay off people. That generally does not lead to a big social unrest or anything, because there's very good programs for retraining, there are good benefits, so people aren't that afraid of making a change or going from one industry to another, which allows the economy to be more dynamic than it would be if you lost this factory, sort of that's the basically end of the town or the end of the innovations, and I'll represented by 5 young ladies that won a prize this last year. One of the good things I think that all the Nordics shares is the way that the Nordics work. We don't work very long. Generally in Norway, people come to work at around 8. And I remember a story in the New York Times writing in horror about the 4 o'clock rush hour. That was unthinkable. And yet people go home at 4 o'clock. Because basically childcare closes at 5, so you better pick up your kid by 5. Otherwise you have a problem. But the good thing with all the Nordic countries is the flat structure. That means, I'm going to move on now to this big ship. This has been described to me. In Korea, where they also make a lot of these high-tech ships, if a guy that's actually welding some of the stuff on the ship sees a problem, he has to call his supervisor. The supervisor then has to call the supervisor and the engineers describing the problem, and then the supervisor and the engineers have to call down to the engineer who drew this ship, trying to explain the problem. What happens in Norway? The welder on the ship picks up the phone, says to the engineer, those drawings you made, they don't work. Sorry, don't work at all. And the engineer goes down to the ship and they communicate directly. It's a very flat structure. It's not like I can't do this without talking to my manager. People can do a lot of stuff without talking to the managers. And that enables more innovation than in many other places. And then, as with the oil, this is from the sea farming. We have been pretty good, again with low corruption, of extracting the profits from a limited good, access to fjords where you can fish farm, or oil concessions, and sort of limited so you get a sustainable industry without overuse, overpopulation, and this again can work if people sort of trust the government to sort of handle the dispersion of a limited economic good. That's not always true. That was just some of the key to the success. What are the challenges? The first, and this is very Norwegian, the first we see on the upper left-hand side there is the price of oil. It has probably gone down a lot since. when that's one of your key commodities, it's going to be a challenge. The second is a flat screen TV. Why have I included that? And we have had a historic change for the positive the last 15 years in Norway in our terms of trade. Norway produces everything that China wants, and we do not compete with all the things that China produces, which has been a very good thing for the last 15, 20 years. So we do not produce, TVs. And I'm very happy to say I've been in, trade negotiations. We don't produce any textiles. We don't have any industries like that. I mean, a Norwegian worker would never compete with a Bangladeshi worker anyway, neither in price and perhaps not in quality. But the challenge is that sort of improvement in the terms of trade would be hard to sustain. With the economic growth we've had the last 15 years, this is true for Finland as well. This is from a paper factory. Some of our traditional industries are struggling due to high costs and very tough competition. And the final illustration is from a Norwegian welfare office. It is called NAV. And I think one of the most, at least to me personally, disturbing things, I think the last 10 years was 3 years ago, they actually coined a verb from the name of this welfare office. And that verb was meant that, some young people said, I'll take a year off and I'll basically, do whatever I want to and the welfare will pay for it. Our system, our model only works if, as Ambassador Miller said, enough people work, enough people are willing to sort of join in the system. If you have enough people that either through lack of skills or personal choice, that, the benefits are so good that they actually, would rather be well-fed in the work, or lack of, matches of skills than others, then our whole system of our whole model would struggle. So where's the future? Again, 4 illustrations before I stop. One, the good thing for Norway and for Sweden and Denmark as well is a flexible exchange rate. It's not good for myself personally, but the dollar has gone down has become 20% more expensive in the last 4 months, which allows a lot of the companies to, improve their competitiveness greatly without having to lower nominal wages, which is a very tough job. The second, the unclear picture, is that welfare I was talking about. Will we manage to keep on working that way? I think that's pretty unique to the Nordics, the flat structure in the workplace that enables innovation, that enables, people to, run up to the bosses and get stuff improved. I remember my first posting. When I talked to my Austrian colleague, he had to say, when he had to talk to him, his ambassador, he said, he had to say, Doctor, Your Excellency. I said, yo, Svein! But the way we work, that sort of makes it much easier to take an idea and put it into practice than it does in a lot of other countries. Again, we're going to have our oil will only be, last us a while. And even though Norway is in the absurd position of owning over 1% of global stock, a country with fewer people than the greater Philadelphia area actually owns over 1% of global stocks. That's sort of a mind-boggling figure. But that's the stuff we're going to be living from. I mean, this is a high-tech oil installation that's down, you put it on the ocean bed and it actually pumps and produces oil down from the ocean bed. But at the end of the day, this is where it comes down to. The people, the human capital. And one thing with the Nordic economic model that Ambassador Miller mentioned, and I think that's hugely important, the women in the workforce. There are some things that has been done politically. In Norway, for example, they came into effect a new law about 10 years ago saying that every boardroom had to have at least 40% of women in. That was a huge uproar. Oh, can't do it, can't find any qualified candidates. 10 years later, we're good. Because obviously it takes a while to get the qualified candidates, but you force innovation by asking people to do this. Another factor that's led to this, huge increase of female participation is the low cost and the prevalence of childcare. For childcare in full-time childcare place in Norway generally costs about $250 a month, which allows both the women and the men. There are more and more men also taking responsibility for their children to work full-time and to have a family. That's also why we have some of the highest birth rates in the Nordic countries compared to the rest of Europe. But to finalize, whatever we can say about oil and everything, these are the people that I have to, compete with China, pay my pension, and we put the system in place. I have all the confidence in the world that they'll do well, but that's where the challenge will be. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi everybody. My name is Jukka Pietikäinen. I'm the Consul General of Finland in New York, and I have been asked to present the Finnish government's view on Nordic model's performance during the and after the financial crisis, and really everything that has happened since 2007, 2008, when the financial crisis started, has changed everything in the sense that what I'm going to tell about the Finnish realities today are not at all optimistic, not as optimistic as other Nordic countries could tell. Maybe the reason is that Finland is part of the only country of the Nordic group that belongs to the Eurozone. So we do not have that flexibility with our currency that other Nordics do, and we are bound to follow the European Central Bank policies. And to be honest, Finland has been and is considered during and after the crisis to be one of the most hawkish, orthodox, economical line of policy governments in the whole Euro group, and has identified itself very much with the German Dutch camp in all economical issues, and that has gained us deservedly, maybe a few years ago, an image of a schoolmaster, a nasty schoolmaster who is lecturing to the poor southern countries of Europe who are going through a very difficult period, how they should have been dealing with their economy. Well, today we are not anymore in that position. Our own economy is going down, and really we are back in the classroom with other students, not anymore as a school teacher or schoolmaster. Yeah, if I would have been given these remarks a few years ago, I would have probably started by saying that despite all difficulties in the Eurozone, Finland can still pride herself of being the country with AAA rating, credit rating and sound economy. Today, this is no longer the case. And I would have probably also talked about Finland's unique position between East and West, neighboring Russia, which is traditionally one of our most important trading partners. And I would have talked about the growing potential of Russian markets, and I would have invited American companies to partner themselves with the Finnish companies to trade with Russians. And today I'm not going to talk about that either. The world has changed dramatically, and we in Finland can feel it clearly. Besides being the only Nordic member of the European Union's Eurozone, we have the longest border with Russia of all the EU member countries. And everything that has happening between the West and Russia, we can feel it quite clearly. But since the outbreak of financial crisis, our exports have declined by around 1/5, which is more than in any other developed country, developed advanced economy. And the decline in exports owes not only to sluggish demand in our main markets. The main reason may be found in structural problems in electronics and paper industries and loss of general cost competitiveness. Our industrial base has been eroding for a few years now. And on the contrary to the United States, foreign trade is very crucial to our economy. Both exports and imports account for about 40% of GDP, as in all other Nordic countries. In the United States, it's 5 to 7%. Or how much? How much is the percentage of foreign trade of GDP? I believe it's 5 to 7%. Yeah. So you have pretty much autonomy for your economic policy, which we don't have in Europe and in Nordic countries. And it is possible that in Finland we will probably regain the pre-crisis level of 2008 in production only by 2018. So we will have a completely lost decade in production. We have lost since 2008, we have lost over 80,000 well-paid industrial jobs, and our external debt has almost doubled. Unemployment rate is around 8.5, but like in the US, in Finland there's a constant stream of people leaving the labor market. People who do not search for work anymore because they have lost their hope of finding one. And latest Bank of Finland central bank forecast a few days ago gave very little hope for the near future, and the outlook over the next few years has also continued to deteriorate. According to our central bank, Finnish GDP is expected to contract 0.2% in 2014 and 0.1% in 2015. And only in 2016, after 4 years of unbroken contraction, the economy will grow at a sluggish 1% in 2016. So this is pretty gloomy picture. And this kind of contraction is and subsequent low growth is exceptional even in historical and international context. Our government deficit will deepen to 2.6% in 2014. It's not that much if we compare to some other European countries, but anyhow, it breaks the limits agreed in the EU's Stability and Growth Pact. And to finance the deficit, the public debt will continue to grow, and in 2016 we will reach almost 60% of the GDP. So these are really worrying trends, and these geopolitical tensions near and far increase uncertainty regarding the future. A further deterioration of Russian economy would have a particularly marked impact on the Finnish economy. But on the other hand, continuing depreciation of euro and falling oil prices could lead to a higher growth. Especially those companies that produce goods which are traded in dollars, like forest sector companies and oil derivatives, will benefit of higher dollar rates against euro. As I said, Finnish government has taken pretty principled and sometimes orthodox stance on economic policy, and the government does not believe in that. They believe that counter-cyclical measures like strengthening of domestic demand would be the medicine to heal the underlying problems. The real progress can be made through structural reforms to enhance the sustainability of public finances and the dynamics of economy. For example, Finland has the fastest aging population in the world. Recently approved pension reform, which brought the minimum retirement age from 63 to 65, was a step towards right direction. It is the opinion of the government that in Finland we need one, responsible fiscal policy, two, continued public investment in education, training and innovation, three, productivity gains from ICT and digitalization, four, more efficient taxation by cutting taxes on labor and also capital, five, higher supply of labor and higher participation rates, six, more flexible labor markets, and seven, more competition, less regulation, and cutting red tape. Sounds like Heritage Foundation. But of course, many people fear that the reforms aimed at making our economies more dynamic will undermine the welfare society which we have built over the post-war decades. And yes, implementing labor market reforms at the time of weak economic performance is challenging. But the government considers the economic competitiveness as the only way preserving and further improving our Nordic model. In an open economy, competitiveness and welfare go hand in hand. What is clear is that Finland has absolutely too few medium-sized companies when compared to our main competitor countries, including other Nordic countries. Medium-sized companies are the ones which invest in domestic production, whereas the big companies rather take their investments to Asia and other emerging economies. Therefore, it is paramount to formulate measures and incentives aimed at increasing the number of medium-sized companies. The conditions for the strengthening of the middle market companies are there. First, automatization is changing manufacturing and make it less dependent on labor. This means that the advantage that emerging countries have had with cheap labor is eroding. The balance is tipping in favor of high skills and innovation. Second, digital technology will transform modern societies. The next level is the Internet of Things, where machines, processes will all be connected, opening door for countless new applications and smart solutions. Productivity gains will be considerable, and Finland, with its advanced society, skilled people, and stable institutions, will thrive in this new environment. These developments may sound abstract, but we can witness them in practice. Finnish paper companies have had rough times because digital media has had such an impact on the demand for paper. The number of paper machines is only half of what it used to be. But the paper companies are transforming, reinventing themselves. They are getting into new business areas using the old raw material, wood, to make new products like biofuels, as well as advanced materials with the help of nanotechnology. And on ICT side, people who were laid off from the former ICT giant Nokia have established hundreds of new mobile technology and gaming companies. Gaming companies like Supercell and Rovio, Angry Birds and Clash of Clans, for example, these games, have grown big just in a few years' time. And Helsinki is today home of the biggest startup event in Europe with 2,000 startups gathering and 14,000 people participating last November. And then finally, a few words about our neighboring country, Russia, and its importance to Finland, because I know that this team interests the audience in the US always. Russia is our most important trading partner. It is by far the biggest imports partner because we import our oil and gas from Russia. And oil and gas account for 18% of all imports. Russia is our third export destiny after Sweden and Germany, while the US in the fourth place in exports. Trade with Russia has diminished significantly this year. During the first 9 months, exports are down by 12% and imports by 15%. European Union economic sanctions are affecting principally our agricultural exports, which have practically ceased to exist in the last few weeks. We have lost, in agriculture, we have lost something like, in the last few weeks, $500 to $600 million worth of exports to Russia. Finnish embassy and especially the Consulate General in St. Petersburg used to process around 2 million visas a year to Russians until the political and economical problems with the West started. Many of them were multiple visas, hence the total number of visits to Finland in 2013 was 5.2 million visits. It's huge amount of tourism. And most of these trips were shopping tours. Tourists from Russia left almost $2 billion a year in Finland. Most of them in small cities of the border area in Karelia. This year, the number of tourists and money spent in Finland will be drastically inferior, mainly due to the deteriorating value of Russian currency, but also due to political tensions. This year only, between January and December, the Russian ruble has lost a lot of its value. It has plummeted from 45 rubles to a euro in January to 77 rubles to euro today. It's tremendous, and it remains to be seen how the Russian economy and reserves can take that. This year, Turkey has also passed Finland as the most important destiny for Russian tourism. This is affecting deeply, especially our towns and municipalities in the border area. From our point of view, the timing for the crisis in Ukraine could not have been worse, and no normalization of the situation is in sight. With this very little optimistic note, I finish here, and I'm ready to ask to answer questions.
Does anybody have a question for the panel?
Yes.
Two related. I thank you for your candor, sir. And I wonder if you could talk about political interests or political attitudes towards involvement with the euro as you need to employ a range of strategic measures to stimulate growth. Certainly in the United States, we're no stranger to the idea of money printing, or as we call it, quantitative easing. There are all sorts of reasons for caution to that trend, and probably at a global level, looking at central bank build-up around the world over the last 10 years, asset balance sheet build-up. Also, Hime, could you discuss, in addition to paper, other commodity
rich industries that could be well positioned in a more in a different environment than that which we currently have in future. And then, if it's thinking back on that, Leif, could you talk a little more about opportunities for continued exploitation of oil resources? Here you have a gem. Thanks.
If I may start?
Yep.
That is a very good and tricky question about the quantitative easing. The truth is that all these decisions on economical policy, you have to make every decision in a political environment, which means that we are going to have elections next April, and the government, which is presided now by the coalition government, which is presided by the Conservative Party, is going to most probably lose, but we don't know how much. Anyhow, any idea, any mentioning at the moment of saying yes to quantitative easing, which means that central bank would buy government bonds, sounds good. It sounds good. You need to print money to buy government bonds, and so there's liquidity in the market. But the thing is that what if these bonds prove to be without value anytime soon? Every government, individual government, which makes part of Eurozone, is responsible for paying those bonds. And who wants, what party wants to say that to the voters before the election that, okay, there's a risk that if we now say yes to quantitative easing, it may be that you have to pay it from your taxes, the Greek bonds or Portuguese bonds. And that's why it's not very popular idea either in among the voters. And that's why government is playing the game it's playing. But indeed, we overplayed our card a few years ago when things were really good. And sky was the limit for the Finnish economy. And we were giving to southern countries of the European Union good advice, even if we were not asked to give any advice. So now that I'm afraid that now that we have rough times and they are getting better times, seeing better times ahead, there won't be much solidarity towards us. So one should always remember to keep that tongue in the middle of the mouth.
Now, shortly on the continued possibilities for oil exploration, our Ministry of Oil and Energy, on regular intervals, they allow, put more licenses out for auction. So, where oil companies can bid, and the highest bidders with the best concept generally get the license and are free to try to explore and try to find more oil. And there have been substantial fines in the last couple of years to just sort of slow the gradual decline of our production.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
And the Nordic countries, as well, your own, as well as Sweden and Denmark, can they feed themselves? Do they have enough agriculture that they don't have to import, or is importing food important?
We have to import a lot of our food, as we have to import every single bit of our oil and gas. We have Arctic, 40% of our territory is about the Arctic Circle. So the conditions are not optimal for banana plantations. It's a rough agricultural area, and we do have to export. We have, of course, this, artificially we can grow some vegetables and so on, which is good. It's going to be better now with the low oil price, but it has been pretty expensive agriculture to have it with the high oil price. So yes, we need to continue fruits, everything that is fruits and so on, we have to import.
Yeah. To just follow up on that, we also import a lot of stuff. Although the funny thing in being an old trade head, for some reason, when you count, feeding yourself, you count agriculture and you don't count fish there. We export an enormous amount of fish, so whether we would sort of be self-sufficient in food, including fish, I wouldn't know, but obviously, Norway is not a great place to grow neither pineapple nor grapes. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering,
Oh,
is there any serious discussion about leaving the euro in Finland?
Not serious. There's always discussion. We have, let's put it this way, that when we joined the euro, when Sweden and Denmark decided to opt out of euro, which was maybe not the worst decision of the history, we got immediately as a response a populist party born in Finland, which got in the last, is very Eurosceptical and very EU-skeptical and very Eurosceptical. And they are against the euro and against the rescue packages and so on. So even though they have never got more than 60-70% in the elections, but they somehow dictate the election themes, and everybody has to play like, to the tune of the ear. What are they saying so that I won't be seen like too Euro-friendly and so on. But anyhow, big majority of the political parties doesn't even consider of leaving. It would be tremendous cost to leave Euro now, and we really don't believe that we would be able to do it without great havoc to our economy if we would try to go back to our own currency or go to currency union with Sweden or whatever. I don't know. There is no serious consideration in serious political circles about leaving Europe. We see that the problem is in Finland is with lack of competitiveness. We let the salaries grow too fast. Our relative salary level is higher than that of Germany. And the productivity in Germany, because of the labor reforms they made in the beginning of 2000, is much higher than in Finland. So we have eaten up our future through salary raises, unsubstantiated salary raises. We are trying to get to the same system as the Norwegians have, which means that the export sector should dictate the level of salary raises to all sectors of the society.
Yes.
You mentioned the loss of trade, in particular in agriculture with Russia. And I just wondered if you could talk about what measures are being taken to find alternative markets to sell these goods in, and also to have, just in the future, less dependency on that one market, because the instability seems like it's going to continue for quite some time.
Yeah. First of all, it would be good that if US would eliminate many of the restrictions on food imports. We have some minor exports to US, but the truth is that Europe is washed with foodstuff. It's very difficult to find alternative markets. You have to find them, if anywhere, you will find them in the Middle East, most probably. But for example, cheese and milk products and so on, you can't. Russia is next door, and we have 5 million people. We have 3 hours 20 minutes railroad trip to St. Petersburg, which has 6 million people in one city. So I mean, they eat and drink everything we produce.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for the panelists, and the panelists for the second panel will come up.
So, this is a shift in gear in the sense that we're leaving the government sector and we'll take a point of view from the private sector. I'm Kathleen Stephenson and I'm chief economist of AIG. Have been there for about 4 years. Before that, I was at Credit Suisse and Aladdin Capital, also in terms of global economics. But more importantly, I'm a board member of the GIC, and it has been a wonderful ride, a short one for the moment, but it's a tremendously interesting think tank, and I would urge you all to look very closely to what we're doing because it's very diverse and interesting. Before I introduce the two panelists, I just want to say one thing in terms of one comment in terms of the possibility of exporting the Nordic model to just perhaps elaborate on one of the items that both the panel beforehand and Ambassador Miller had mentioned, namely the participation of women in the workforce. What's interesting is that Abenomics, so Prime Minister Abe, has taken a page from one item, namely the participation of women. And for the past 18 months, that participation has risen by 2.4%. And this is, of course, to kickstart the economy over there. And how did they do that? Well, a very innovative idea. They, in Japan, built or opened 150,000 daycare centers. So you can see that from one very simple little motion, you can really go quite far away. Anyways, so just now to what we would like to do is maybe change a little bit the way we will discuss this. I will ask Robert Bergqvist to talk about his view on the Nordic countries for a few minutes, and he has a presentation, and then ask Lars Björk to come and speak about his experience, and then I will take advantage of my role as a moderator to ask them a few questions, and hopefully that will elicit questions and reaction from the audience. So let's start first with Robert Bergqvist. He is chief economist at SE Banken, has been chief economist since 2007. Before that, he was an economist, but also head of the analysis division at the Swedish Central Bank. And he has quite a few professional responsibilities, appointment on several international central bank working committees. So question about quantitative easing and some definitely should be asked to him. Lars Björk, he is CEO and a member of the companies, the company that he is at the moment driving into the 22nd century, Click. He's also a board member of that company. Very interesting company. And he also oversaw the company's initial public offering in 2010. And what's very interesting about this firm is not only the fact that it is in technology as an industry, but also a very, very fast-growing industry as well as a company. So we would like to definitely hear about this. Before click. Lars held several positions as CFO at companies such as Skanska and Resource Finance, and that was, I suspect, in Sweden. And now he is here full-time in the US as well as, I should say, the global economy. But let's first hear from Robert, and then we'll hear from Lars, and we'll have a discussion. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I can tell you that we also had some problems in Sweden 20 years ago. When I worked for the Riksbank, the policy rate was 500%. Today it's 0%, so it's a big difference. You can see from my subtitle, the Nordic model is their model. I will give you some reflections about how I look upon the current situation, and also some thoughts about the future. So let's start with what you can call this kind of peculiar Nordic model, some reflections. I think it's quite obvious that on the one hand we have quite big trade unions, quite important trade unions. Maybe you could say that they have become maybe less important for the Nordic countries, but still they are there. Looking at the size of the industry, lots of big multinational industry, if you compare it to the size of the economies. We have a big government in many countries, or in the Nordic countries, high taxes, we have heard about that before, and also inclusive welfare state. That is on the one hand. On the other hand, we are open economies. We're very much dependent on the external environment. We are showing readiness to innovate. Most of us, we have deregulated markets for some time. And I will also say that we have very much market-oriented agencies, and that is quite important for of course, in the current situation. When we are focusing a lot on the Nordic countries, I think that we are thinking, because the Nordic model and discussion about the Nordic model has been on the agenda for at least for the last couple of years. And I think the main reason is, of course, that we have seen fairly good economic performance for the Nordic countries in the last couple of years. And if you look at the situation today, I would say that the economic result is at least so far is quite good. If you look at the internal, external balances, if you look at the government finances, current account balances, the external debt, etc., it looks quite strong. Low inflation environment, maybe too low inflation. We have some problems with inflation in Sweden right now, the lack of inflation. Labor market strength, I would say that if you look at least Norway and Denmark, to some extent also underlying strength in Sweden. Productivity buffers, and also well-consolidated banking systems. And I think to some extent this is a reflection on or an effect of the banking crisis that we had in the Nordic countries in the early 90s. So when you talk about a Nordic model, I think that lots of people, at least when you travel in Asia, they are thinking about the kind of mix between capitalism and socialism. I would say that I look upon the Nordic model as a kind of combination of strong individualism and a strong state. So I think that's a big difference. So looking at when we talk about the common Nordic economic model, I'm not so sure that we have this kind of Nordic model, but I think we have common experience, Nordic experience, that has been very useful. If you look at the 4 Nordic countries, and of course when I talk about Nordic countries, I exclude Iceland. Iceland is of course also quite important, but looking at the other 4 Nordic countries, I cannot see common macroeconomic policies. And also what we have heard about before, we have seen, or we have different monetary or ethics strategies. We have different also euro policies. We have 2 countries outside the euro area, Sweden and Norway, with floating currencies. That has been quite important, of course, during the crisis. Then you have Denmark, The Danish krona is pegged to the euro, and of course Finland as a member of the euro area. But as I said, I think we have common experience from the crisis in the early 90s, because if you go back and look at the situation in the Nordic countries during the 70s and the 80s, we also had very big problems, cost problems, etc. It's kind of cost crisis, wages rose too much. We had the real estate crisis in the early 90s. Also fiscal crisis, when you talk about Sweden. We define it as a fiscal crisis. Our government debt reached 80% of GDP. We thought that that was a high level, but if you look at many of the countries today, you can see that the debt levels are much higher than that. But still, at that time, it was a very high government debt. The banking crisis, and also the currency crisis. And what we have delivered, that's kind of common solutions to the crisis. We decided to float the currency in Sweden, Norway, also in Finland. We introduced inflation targets. Maybe you could discuss that today, because as I said in the beginning, it's a bit difficult to generate inflation. So I think that in Sweden and maybe also in Norway, we are facing kind of inflation target crisis, and maybe we're going to see that also in other countries. But in the early 90s, we also introduced the independent central banks, fiscal rules, so that we should get strong government finances. In the mid-90s, we decided in Sweden to join the EU, but we decided also to stay outside the euro area. We had a referendum about the euro in 2003, not a very strong support for the euro. And I think it was a very good idea to stay outside the euro area. I must say, I think it was a bit stupid to introduce the euro, because I think it was too early. Some people said that, well, the euro is, some people believe that the euro is the aim of the cooperation that you have between the 18 Eurozone countries, but I think it's quite obvious that the euro is the instrument to create the political union, and if you don't want to be part of the political union, the United States of the euro area, you should not adopt the euro. But still, we decided to, in Sweden, decided to join the EU. In Norway, of course, you're still outside the EU. In Denmark, Denmark has also decided to stay outside the euro area, but Finland has taken this kind of full step into the euro area, and as we have heard about that earlier. And then, of course, also pension reforms and the regulations. Talking about the future, I think that the euro is still out. Talking about the economic model, I think that we are also facing lots of challenges. Starting with financing the welfare state, because looking at the situation in the Nordic countries, we have demographic challenges. We have aging populations, and that will be very costly, as in many other countries. And also, if you look at the Nordic countries, I would say that we will start from a higher cost level, and we have higher ambitions when it comes to pensions, which will be a challenge going forward. And when I look at the four Nordic countries today, I cannot see this kind of broad understanding of the challenges that we have in front of us. The second issue or challenge, that will be employment and immigration, especially I would say in Sweden. We have a growing group, if you look at the labor market situation, we have a growing group of long-term unemployed people and outsiders. We have to think about how to get a better functioning labor market. We have difficulties to integrate immigrants. Today, if you look at Sweden, the population growth is around 1% per year. Almost everything is explained by immigration. And I think that is very good for Sweden in a kind of long-term perspective with aging population. But in the short term, if you don't have integration policies, it means that you will have some challenges for government finances. It means also that you can also face political risks, political challenges, social risks, etc. And if you look at the political situation today in Sweden, we have one growing political party, Sweden Democratic Party, that would like to limit the immigration, and that is actually creating a political crisis in Sweden right now. And this rise of populism, we see it also in the Nordic countries, as you see in many countries in Europe. And this is, of course, a challenge going forward. And of course, finally, globalization. It's quite obvious that we face these kind of challenges from countries like India and China. Finally, looking at the future, it's quite interesting to look at the developments since the outbreak of the crisis. The starting point on the left-hand side, that is of course the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and you can see that Norway succeeded in having a kind of mild recession. That is of course due to the oil. That was quite good for Norway. In Sweden, a deeper slowdown and recession, and the recovery was quite impressive, but I think that was partly due to the depreciation of the currency. So the currency was quite important. Looking at the situation today, well, Sweden, the economy is roughly 7-8% bigger than it was before the crisis. Norway, roughly 5% bigger than before the crisis. And then when you look at Finland and Denmark, we are still below pre-crisis levels. So it's quite interesting to see these kind of different and diverging economic developments for the four Nordic countries. And of course, but we have heard all about the Finnish economy, of course, all the challenges that we see. My forecast for the four Nordic countries, you can see it in a table on the right-hand side. What I think that will be very important for the outlook for the four Nordic countries, that is of course the oil price. It has been good for Norway in what we have seen the last couple of years, but now it's of course a challenge. I think the oil price right now is below the break-even level for Norway, and that will have negative impact on investments, and that means also possible spillover effects on the Norwegian economy. We have Russia that we have been talking about. When I listen to corporates, they say that they have been, of course, affected by trade sanctions, but they are much more concerned about the political situation, and that means also slowdown of investments, that you postpone investments because you have this kind of political situation in Russia, and of course the implications on other countries. The industry, I'm thinking especially about the situation in Finland, the paper and pulp industry, the telecom industry, and of course this kind of transition that you have to go through, and of course a very challenging environment for Finland going forward. And finally, the currency, I think, will continue to be very important for the outlook for the Nordic countries. It's quite obvious right now that Sweden and Norway, the central banks of Sweden and Norway, they would like to have weak currency to generate not only economic growth but also inflation. That will not be the case for Finland, and will not be the case for Denmark, which have pegged their currencies or are a member of the euro area. So I think this just suggests that we could see these kind of diverging developments going forward. Yes, I think I will stop there.
So perhaps before we get into the discussion, Lars, would you want to just comment on your experience?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We can leave the student's picture. That's fine. Because it's actually, where's it taken? Somewhere in Europe.
So, good afternoon. My name is Lars Bjork. I'm the CEO of Nordic. How many of you are a user of our product? Oh, that's a great opportunity. I'll see you after. So, I was invited here. I represent a public software company. We do enterprise software. Ambassador Miller can very well make good use of it, and all the other speakers too, because what we do is business intelligence analytics software. So we pull together data and make it visually attractive and very easy to sift through data, slice and dice, make better decisions based on facts. The story that we have is, how do you take a company that was founded 20 years ago, and in its first 7 years of inception, it was very much a small incubator in a science park in Sweden. So think about year 2000 till today, from nothing in revenue to $550 million. Because that's what we've done. And it won't stop here, I can tell you that, because the market is infinite. can't say that. My legal counsel gets mad if I say that. The market is large. So it was interesting listening to you, sir, here, and the other speakers too, because you touch on a number of things that I think we've done well. When I try to describe what Click is today, it's a global software company headquartered in the United States with a Swedish soul. And what I mean by the Swedish soul is a lot of the things that I think you put words on when we started this session. That's the fact that we have built a very strong corporate culture inside the company that comes down to trust, openness, consensus-driven decision-making. In many ways, we are a very, very flat organization. I think it was described here by Ambassador Leif Trana as well. You don't go and ask your boss to ask the boss in a different department. You just go to the person you need to get something done with, or call the person or Skype the person. And my label, you put virtual labels up here. I think we are, my experience, living in this country now for 8 years, having built a software company that is now headquartered here, Swedes and Scandinavians, I probably can speak more for Swedes, we're very practical and pragmatic. And sometimes it can frustrate you, for instance, when you're in this country. Why did this country, for instance, when it built out its public sector, look to Russia as a role model? That wasn't a good example. You could have looked somewhere else, because there's lots of inefficiencies. What we have done to get from almost nothing to over $500 million, which is the target for this year, or 555 is the high end of the guidance, is to continue to build a model on that culture that I spoke about before. It's where we hire the best people in the industry, regardless of where we are in the world. And we have presence in over 20 countries. We've sold to more than 120 countries. We have an extensive amount of partners that represent our product on the same premise. It's built on trust, it's built on empowerment, it's built on accountability, and it's built on setting very, very ambitious targets. And so far it has worked out very well, and I think it can continue to do so. I can go on forever. I'll stop there and we can take questions instead.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm going to essentially as I mentioned, take advantage of my role here as a moderator to ask a few questions. And Lars, starting with you, innovation. This has been a theme that we talked about. Did you think that moving the company from Sweden to the US enhanced the innovation, or the decision making was much more that, well, the markets were just too small and you just had to expand? And why the US then?
I think it's a combination of those things. Clearly the market was too small. I think a lot of companies that are founded in Scandinavia already at the outset, if they want to be big, realize that the market is not going to be the home market, which is very different from a company founded in this country, which we heard from Jukka here. You are not relying on import and export in this country. You totally are, which this gentleman knows very well in the Scandinavian countries. What we have done, though, we have left product innovation more or less up till now still in Sweden. So we have R&D still in Sweden because it's been a very efficient labor market, it's cost effective, and it served us well. So we haven't, in our industry, you can stick your head into the talent war of Silicon Valley, which right now is very expensive and not sure you will long-term be beneficial. But I think we also benefited on the business side by moving headquarters to the US, which we did 7 or 8 years ago when I moved over. Because when it comes to go-to-market and being competitive on business models, this market is more competitive, my experience at least, than the Scandinavian markets. I always make fun of my Swedish friends. If you think you're in competition, no, you're not. Move to the United States. There's more competition here. So in that sense, I think it's a combination. And I see ourselves very much as a global player in that sense.
Now, Robert, just really very eager to ask you this question because I don't think that we touched upon this, and this is with regard to, and it's shifting a little bit. We'll come back to the arena of innovation, but high household debt. We talked about government debt, but not household debt, and that seems to be a common theme, I should say, in the Nordic countries. Now, it's true that the fiscal and the taxation is somewhat conducive to this, but is this an issue that you are worried about?
Well, I think it's a kind of challenging situation, and of course, I should also say when we talk about private sector debt and household debt, I would say that we are thinking about Sweden, Norway, Denmark, but not Finland. I think when you look at the household debt, you have to find the reason for a high household debt, and of course, to some extent, it's of course a low interest rate environment. But I think the main explanation that is actually rising house prices. And then you have to ask, why do we have rising house prices? Well, in Sweden, I would say it's due to the fact that we have a kind of structured deficit of houses. The last 10, 15 years, we should have built much more houses. But we haven't done that, and that creates actually an upward pressure on prices. And that means, of course, that households must increase also their indebtedness. Maybe I'm slightly more concerned about the situation in Norway, because I can see more of this kind of speculative behavior in the Norwegian housing market. But when you look at the debt situation for a country, I think you have to combine the public sector debt and also the private sector debt. And I think when I look at Norway, I think it should be quite, I shouldn't say normal, but you can justify higher private sector debt, higher household debt, if the government, as you have in Norway, if the government is running very large surpluses and that they're also generating wealth, as you have within the petroleum fund. So I think that we have to follow the developments very closely. Of course, we are very sensitive to changes in interest rates going forward, even though it's a bit difficult to say when we should expect high interest rates right now, because we don't have very much of inflation problems. But it could be a challenge going forward, I think.
And just one last question, and then I'll open it up to the audience for both of you. Investment trends tend to be on the weak side in the region. And what do you think would be the catalyst for renewal in investment? You from an economist viewpoint, and you from an entrepreneur standpoint.
If I start with the Nordic area and look at it and put it in a kind of global perspective, I would say that we have a kind of weak investment cycle globally right now. And when I talk to corporates about this, they are telling me that why should we make investment in production capacity? Why should we hire people? Because the world economy is running with excess capacity. So that is, I would say, the starting point. So it's the same story for the Nordic countries as it is for many other countries around the globe. I think that the investment cycle will start at some point, but I think for a country like Sweden, if you look at the export sector, we have seen lots of challenges for the export sector, and that is of course due to the fact that we have a big portion of investment goods in our exports. But I think that at some point we are going to see globally a strong investment cycle, and then I think you are also going to see a recovery when it comes to investments within the Nordic area. But I also would like to add one more thing, and that is of course the political situation, because we have right now, I would say, a weak government in Finland. As we heard, we have a an election coming up in April. We have a weak government in Sweden, and when you have, and we have also election coming up in March next year. I think when you look at the global economy right now, one of the biggest problems that we have right now, that is a lack of confidence about the future. And if the political situation is adding to these kind of problems, uncertainties, then it, of course, it's not good. Right now, it's very important that the political systems can provide stable, say, game rules for economic decisions. And that is not what you see is happening right now, I would say, in Finland and Sweden.
Thank you. Lars, what is your viewpoint?
I think we are seeing something slightly different, probably because we are in a sector that's somewhat shielded from this. It's a sector that an investment in our products would benefit you even more in a tough economy because you get a good grip on your business, you can find out where you can make your savings, and clearly we drive insights for corporations. So we see strong growth in all of the Nordic countries right now, and it's still a fairly sizable piece of our market. We have 25% of the market in Sweden, for instance. So I don't think we are a fair representation of all of the corporations. I know others are having a tougher time.
Well, that's a very positive note. So on that, maybe I'll open it to, yes, sir, to the audience.
First of all, I'd like to, I'm a GIC board member, and I'd like to thank the panel and the previous panel and all the other speakers. This has been a very enlightening session. For Lars, one question based, two parts. If you could change one thing about your business and relative to working in Sweden, what would it be? And the same applies to what would it be in the US, if you could change one thing for operations here and operations in Sweden.
Yeah, so in Sweden, it's probably touched on by other people. The dilemma of having too much comfort around you could be that you get to be really comfortable, complacent, or fat cat. So I can tell you the story is that we bring in outside management even to Sweden from other countries, and one of the reflections they do is people work very hard here when they work. So because the lifestyle is based on that I think we're practical and pragmatic, but you leave to pick up your kids. You might turn on your computer later and work, but it's not really seen. So is the light on after 5 p.m. in the Nordic countries? No, not as much as it is here. And the one here, I think, is almost politically impossible. Shouldn't even say it. The fact that you run 50 states in this country is highly inefficient as a corporation. To deal with all the 50 states, in Sweden, you file one tax reform for a tax application for all your taxes that month, whatever that is, VAT, withdrawn taxes from the employees. In this country, there are 2,700 offices that collects sales taxes. So what does most people do in this country? They don't pay sales taxes until you reach a certain size. So hugely inefficient. I'm just one that and I think this goes across, why is the healthcare so inefficient? I wouldn't complain about that because it's a great vertical for us. We're helping out the healthcare industry too. But it's one of those things. I think we are very practical and pragmatic, and you sometimes expect that from other parts of the world too.
Yes, sir.
Lars, you've painted a very compelling picture of the innovation and intellectual capital that your company possesses. Your willingness to draw on the home team in Sweden while taking the stage of the world's foremost selling market, the United States, seems quite brilliant. What other Nordic companies do you look to who seem to have been equally agile in leveraging the intellectual and perceptual appeal of a Nordic brand?
So in my sector, I don't think there is anyone ahead of us that have done something. So I hope I can be a source of help for others. I have a person very close to me who I think we can say has done something similar in a very different industry, and that's my uncle, Claes Bjork, who was instrumental in building Skanska, a big construction company, specifically the US arm, and then becoming the global CEO. But I would probably say, and Robert might know the statistics, there are too few companies from Sweden that have had the stamina, the endurance, the financial muscle to establish themselves in the US. And I think a lot of the mistakes that people do is that they try to capture and conquer this country in one go. We didn't do that. We are much stronger on the East Coast than we are on the West Coast right now. We are much stronger in New England than we are in the southern states of this country, because that is enough of a market. From our office in right outside of the town here, 4-hour drive, you reach 50% more people than in all the Nordic countries.
Any other questions, sir?
I don't know if you can address this, but a couple of years ago, I heard that the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean passage over the Arctic is open now. Has that impacted the Nordic economy in any way? And is climate change a point of discussion?
I would say the impact is fairly limited, and of course I think maybe it's a bit too early to give a final answer to that question, because we have had, I think we are still in this kind of post-recession situation, and it is difficult to evaluate these kind of things that could actually affect your economy. But I would say that what we have seen so far is the impact is quite limited, and when we are making our forecast, that is not I would say an important thing to look at.
You know, is there much commerce in the shipping lanes across the Arctic?
I cannot say that. Sorry.
No.
Just to answer to your question, there are two types of Arctic activities. One is the transit, of commerce, and the second is prospects and all the projects of oil and gas in the Arctic areas. Obviously now the oil and gas projects with the oil price are, being slowed down or frozen for the moment. But yes, I would believe that, for example, in Finland, we are prepared to build and offer icebreakers to the Northeast Passage, especially for transit from China to Europe and vice versa. No doubt that will happen, but it's still a little, more than about that than I do.
Yeah, the facts, it has increased from like 4 ships a year to 80 ships. So yes, it's increasing, but it's still a very limited amount of ships. And the main reason why it's a limited amount of ships is if you want shipping up there, you would need ports, you would need search and rescue capabilities, and those things just aren't there. The Russians are investing a lot of money trying to sort of build up a structure for that, as are my country, but still, we're still a long way. The Arctic is still frozen much of the year, and it's still a very inhospitable place. But with the projections you see for climate change, it could be something that could happen in the next 30, 40, 50 years. But as of now, it's still very limited.
And Denmark just claimed possession of part of the North Pole. I think it was reported today in the FT.
Yes.
Wow. Can't trust those things.
Is there a lane grab going on? Ice grab going on?
No, it's a discussion. George, you had a question? Or?
Yes. The European Union, it's closer, of course, to Finland in terms of common currency, but the Union right now, as we understand, goes through a recession. What do you think might be the impact on the Nordic economies, given the fact that the major trading partner is going on a recession?
Robert, that's yours.
Yeah.
It has your name on it.
Well, I think the impact will be quite big, and because we are very, if you look at all the 4 Nordic countries, we are very dependent on exports to Europe. So when we make our forecast, and when you saw my table, we rely very much on domestic demand. We hope that private consumption and also investments and residential construction should provide support to our economies. But if we could end up with say worse situation if these kind of developments in Europe and also of course the political developments in Russia, if that affects consumer confidence, also to some extent business confidence, then I think that I have to make downward revisions of our forecast. But looking at the developments in Europe, I think it will take quite a long time to get back to some kind of normal situation, because we still have lots of debt in Europe, public debt, private sector debt, and we have to get rid of that, and that means that it will have a negative impact on economic growth, and it means also that monetary policy, if we talk about the European Central Bank, monetary policy will be less efficient. And I was thinking about this earlier comment about quantitative easing, that maybe the ECB, European Central Bank, should do more. But we should not forget that will not solve the problems for the Eurozone. Maybe you can buy some time. And thinking about Finland being the possibility being outside the euro area, and maybe you will get weak currency, but weak currency, that is not the solution to the problem. That should also buy you some time. So sometimes I think we are focusing maybe too much on central banks and what they can deliver. We have to deal with these kind of structured challenges that we have in Europe, and that will take time, and that will continue to be a negative growth factor for the Nordic countries.
So are there particular sectors of Norway or Sweden or Denmark or Finland that are sort of ripe for private sector investment?
I think that, as I said, since I believe that the domestic economy will be the key driver for economic growth, the service sector, etc., and different kind of services, that will be quite important. And that is a positive thing that's happening right now. If I take Sweden as an example, if I look at trade with goods, our surplus with our trade surplus with goods is now declining quite substantially. On the other hand, our trade surplus for services is rising and is now compensating for this loss in export of goods. So that is one thing. And also when I look at the composition of our economy, we can also see that we have a declining in industrial production right now in Sweden. On the other hand, we see rising service production. So there is something that is happening right now, and that these economies are becoming more dependent on the service sector. I think that, if I still continue to focus on Sweden, I think that we're talking about that the industry, the manufacturing industry is becoming smaller in Sweden compared to a couple of years ago, and I think that is what we should expect, because the Swedish krona has been undervalued for a quite long time, and that has provided maybe too much stimulus to the export sector. So at some point in the future, we're going to see a more fair value for the Swedish krona, and that means, of course, that some export industries will face more challenges, and that will have a negative impact on the overall size of the manufacturing industry. So I think that will change going forward. So the service sector will expand, I think, in these countries.
So of course this is music to Lars' ears. Yeah. You know, service sector, software, just go.
We'll hire more people.
So he's going to be single-handedly the employer of.
No, I don't think so.
No, all right. You know, in a few years.
Follow up. What services are being exported?
Well, I will say it's well, the Nordic countries, we have, I would say, long experience from making investments, buying corporates in other countries, so very large foreign direct investments. So the export is coming primarily from these kind of services that have some kind of connection to our foreign direct investments.
So I know that Ben is itching here to give us a few remarks before we adjourn. I don't know if there is any more questions. If not, I certainly want to thank the panel for this very interesting discussion. And also I would want to thank the audience for making this an exciting exchange.
I'll be very brief. Thank you all for coming. This is a great slide to end on. And we talked everything today from gender equality to the North Pole to monetary policy. I don't know where else you get that except for a GIC conference. So thank you for everybody for coming, all of our panelists, our sponsors, and our speakers. And please come join us in Salt Lake City in January. Thanks very much.
But I know she did. That's the problem. It's great. And my next door is a very nice guy. Better than mine. Next Are you living? Are you staying?
That's all right. That's all right. Hey, I
And then what is the like? So I'd be very surprised.